For most of the 20th century, being rich was acceptable. Being extremely rich was suspicious, and being obscenely rich was often considered a sign that something had gone wrong in the system. Yet within a single generation, that moral instinct quietly reversed, and today we live in a world where the accumulation of billions is treated not as an anomaly, but as evidence that the system is working exactly as intended. A transformation so complete that it feels natural, almost inevitable, even though it is historically very new. And understanding how that reversal happened requires us to step back to a moment of deep economic fear, when inflation was high, growth was weak, trust in institutions was collapsing, and two leaders on opposite sides of the Atlantic offered an answer that did not simply change policies, but rewired how entire societies thought about money, power, and responsibility. Because the world that produced today's billionaires was not born accidentally. It was constructed deliberately, piece by piece, under the leadership of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, not through a single law or speech, but through a sustained redefinition of what governments were for, what markets deserved, and what inequality meant. And to see why their ideas took hold, we must first understand the crisis that made them possible. As the 1970s in Britain and the United States were not merely difficult years, but humiliating ones, defined by oil shocks, stagnant productivity, rising unemployment, powerful labor unions, frequent strikes, and a sense that the post-war economic model, built on state intervention, welfare expansion, and managed capitalism, had reached its limits, creating a psychological environment where voters were no longer asking for fairness or security, but for control, stability, and a return to growth at almost any cost. And it was into this atmosphere that Thatcher and Reagan stepped, each arguing in different accents but with the same underlying message, that the problem was not too little government competence, but too much government presence, that the state had crowded out initiative, smothered efficiency, and weakened national character, and that prosperity would return only if markets were liberated, taxes reduced, regulations rolled back, and individuals forced to rely more on themselves than on public systems. An argument that resonated not because it was proven, but because it felt emotionally satisfying to societies exhausted by chaos and decline. And this is where the deeper psychological shift began, because both leaders reframed economic pain not as a collective failure requiring collective solutions, but as evidence that collective solutions themselves were the failure. And once that framing took hold, policies that would previously have been politically unthinkable became not only possible but popular. As Thatcher confronted Britain's unions with unprecedented force, breaking strikes, privatizing state-owned industries, and declaring that there was no such thing as society, only individuals and families, a phrase that shocked critics but clarified her worldview with brutal honesty. While Reagan, with a warmer tone but equally radical intent, slashed top marginal tax rates, weakened antitrust enforcement, deregulated finance, and spoke of government as the problem rather than the solution. And in both cases, the immediate effects were mixed, with inflation eventually tamed and growth returning, but unemployment initially rising, inequality beginning to widen, and traditional industrial communities hollowed out. Changes that were painful but could be justified in the short term as necessary adjustments. Yet the true significance of these reforms lay not in their immediate outcomes, but in the incentives they created for the future. Because once taxes on the highest incomes were dramatically reduced and capital gains treated more favorably than wages, the rational response for those with resources was to restructure their activities around capital accumulation rather than productive investment, while privatization transferred public assets into private hands, often at prices that favored insiders, creating new fortunes not through innovation but through ownership, and deregulation, particularly in finance, allowed leverage, speculation, and complex financial instruments to grow far faster than the real economy, setting the stage for a world in which wealth could multiply without a corresponding increase in goods, services, or shared prosperity. And this is how the billionaire world order began to take shape, not as a conspiracy, but as an ecosystem where the rules consistently rewarded scale, risk-taking with limited downside, and the concentration of assets, all while presenting these outcomes as the natural result of merit and efficiency. a narrative that was reinforced by the language Thatcher and Reagan used, because they did not merely argue for different policies, they told a story about human nature itself, one in which people were motivated primarily by self-interest, competition produced the best outcomes, and inequality was not a moral problem, but a signal that rewards were being correctly allocated. A story that made extreme wealth not only acceptable, but admirable, while subtly shifting blame for poverty onto individual failure, rather than structural conditions. And as this worldview spread beyond the United Kingdom and the United States through international institutions, trade agreements, and policy advice, it reshaped the global economy, encouraging developing countries to liberalize markets, cut social spending, and open themselves to foreign capital, often with uneven results. While within advanced economies, the balance of power tilted steadily away from labor and toward capital, as union membership declined, job security weakened, and wages stagnated even as productivity rose. A divergence that was not accidental but entirely consistent with a system designed to prioritize returns to ownership over returns to work. And it is here that the psychological dimension becomes crucial, because most people did not experience these changes as a clear ideological shift, but as a series of small adjustments, a tax cut here, a privatization there, a deregulation justified as modernization, each one easy to accept in isolation, but together they produced a radically different economic landscape, one in which risk was socialized during crises, while gains remained private during booms, reinforcing the upward flow of wealth over decades. And as financial markets expanded and executive compensation became increasingly tied to stock performance, corporate leaders were incentivized to focus on short-term share price rather than long-term investment, leading to practices like stock buybacks, aggressive cost-cutting, and the outsourcing of labor, all of which boosted valuations and personal fortunes while weakening the underlying resilience of companies and communities. And because these practices were legal, normalized, and often praised as shareholder-friendly, they further entrenched the idea that maximizing wealth for a small group was synonymous with economic success, an idea that would have been far more controversial in the era before Thatcher and Reagan, but now felt like common sense. And this shift also changed how governments behaved, as lower taxes on the wealthy reduced public revenues, creating pressure to cut services or borrow, which in turn made states more dependent on financial markets, subtly reversing the relationship between democratic governments and capital, as policy increasingly had to consider how investors might react, a constraint that limited the range of acceptable economic choices and reinforced the dominance of market logic over social considerations. And over time, this feedback loop deepened because concentrated wealth translated into political influence through lobbying, campaign finance, and control over media narratives, shaping laws and public opinion in ways that further protected and expanded that wealth, all without requiring overt authoritarianism or the abandonment of democratic forms, making the system remarkably stable and difficult to challenge. And yet, it is important to note that neither Thatcher nor Reagan set out explicitly to create a world of billionaires as an end in itself, as their stated goals were national renewal, economic efficiency, and individual freedom. But the tools they chose, grounded in a belief that markets left to their own devices would allocate resources optimally, ignored the reality that markets reflect existing power structures and amplify them over time, meaning that those who start with advantages, whether capital, connections, or information, are best positioned to benefit. And as these advantages compound across generations, wealth becomes increasingly detached from productive contribution, turning into a self-reinforcing status rather than a byproduct of value creation. And this is why the billionaire class today often derives its power not from what it produces, but from what it owns, controls, or influences. A distinction that matters because it shapes how economies respond to shocks, as seen in repeated financial crises, where losses are absorbed by the public while recoveries disproportionately benefit asset holders, a pattern that traces directly back to the deregulated, finance-centered model that emerged in the 1980s.
And yet, despite these outcomes, the ideological framework established during that era remains remarkably resilient, in part because it aligns with deep-seated psychological tendencies, such as the desire to believe that success is earned, that the system is fair, and that extreme outcomes reflect extreme effort or talent. Beliefs that provide comfort even when evidence suggests otherwise, and also because alternatives are often framed as dangerous, inefficient, or naive, drawing on the failures of earlier state-led models to shut down discussion rather than encourage nuanced reform. And so, the legacy of Thatcher and Reagan is not simply a set of policies, but a mental map that continues to guide decision-making long after their terms ended, influencing how policymakers respond to inequality, how corporations define success, and how individuals interpret their own economic struggles, often internalizing systemic problems as personal shortcomings, which reduces collective pressure for change. And this is perhaps the most profound consequence of the billionaire world order, that it normalizes a level of inequality that would have been politically explosive in earlier decades by embedding it within a story of freedom, choice, and inevitability, making resistance feel not only difficult, but somehow inappropriate. And yet, history reminds us that economic systems are never permanent, that they are shaped by choices, incentives, and beliefs that can evolve even if slowly, and that the world built in the 1980s emerged from a specific crisis and a specific set of assumptions that solved some problems while creating others. And understanding that origin does not require nostalgia for the past or denial of the gains achieved, but it does require honesty about trade-offs, about who benefited and who bore the costs, and about how narratives can be as powerful as laws in shaping reality. Because the billionaire world order did not arrive with a declaration or a single moment of rupture. It crept in through policy reforms framed as common sense, through cultural shifts that celebrated wealth as virtue, and through psychological adjustments that taught societies to accept concentration as efficiency. And once those foundations were laid, the rest followed naturally, until a world that once feared excessive wealth came to depend on it, admire it, and defend it, even as it quietly reshapes the balance between democracy, markets, and human dignity, leaving us with an uncomfortable realization that the economic environment we inhabit is not the result of immutable forces, but of ideas made real, ideas that can endure long after their architects are gone, continuing to shape lives, opportunities, and expectations in ways that feel invisible precisely because they have become normal.